Thank you so much for this introduction and for hosting this event. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be discussing the book with Marcus tonight. So I guess I don't have to do any housekeeping. You know how it's going to work. We're going to have a discussion with Marcus first. I'll ask him a few questions. But then, of course, if you have any questions, do feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll make sure we'll leave enough time to go through anything that you want to ask him, and that we kind of get that discussion going as well. So, as I said, I'm really pleased to be participating in this event. I was in fact really pleased when I received when Repeater sent me the copy of the book before it came out. I felt quite honored in a way and quite special, And when I got the book, or when Repeater asked me if I wanted that copy of the book, I thought like, yeah, this is amazing. I really need to get my hands on this, because we need far more work, I think, on the concept of fake news. And so I was really excited because I thought it would be about fake news, but actually the book is a lot more than that. And it goes far beyond fake news. It talks about fake news, of course, in a very like in-depth manner, but it goes beyond that, and it looks at power relationships, power shifts, and the way fake news is a problem in our society, but also the way we talk about fake news is a problem in our society. And I found that particularly interesting. So I have a book here. You also have the image on your Zoom, and you have it behind Marcus as well, product placement there. So you know, if you haven't bought it yet, surely by this you will have to. So we'll be discussing a few of the big themes that really kind of struck me, but we will only really be scratching the surface of the book, because there's a lot in there. As you can see, it's a big book. So we'll be scratching the surface. If you've read it, please do ask questions about it. If you haven't, please do throw anything at Marcus, and I'm sure he'll be happy to kind of answer anything. So without kind of further ado, we'll start. And really, my first question is quite topical. Obviously, your book came out about a month ago now, and obviously you finished writing it a few months ago by the time kind of it went to press and all of this. So you wrote it before the elections in the United States. And so my first question is your book still relevant, Marcus, or is it, you know, now that we don't have Trump anymore in the we still have Trump in the White House, but now that he's on his way out, are we moving to a new normal? Is it the end of the fake news era?
Wow, okay, that's a very, very good question. I think before I go to that, I would also just like to say thank you very much first to Houseman's Bookshop, one of my favorite places in London to visit, and where I had my book launch for the last book. And also thank you very much, Aurelien, for doing this. I heard Aurelien speak once and about a paper that he had written, and then immediately went and read the paper, and that paper made it into the book, actually. So it's a real honor to have you doing this here with me. So as far as the question, you know, is the book still relevant? I mean, I must admit, I wrote this book with the kind of subtle pessimism of imagining that there would probably be a second Trump term. So I did actually publicly predict a second Trump term on Twitter. So I need to put my hands up here at least and say I got that part wrong. But the instincts that led me to predict that and that led me to write this book in a way are, I think, still being vindicated every day, and will be vindicated very much by the incoming Biden administration. And there's something about, in a way, the relationship between the type of politics that Trump has come to embody in the last 4 years and the type of politics that Biden and other politicians around the world, who again sort of are part of the same broad church, we could say Keir Starmer or Macron or certain other sort of what we might call centrists, and how they're kind of, I guess, locked in a sort of symbiosis that I think actually means that if we try to go back to normal, which I think is going to be the temptation for some of us, we will probably end up with more Trumps. And I think that's in some senses one of the problems that the book is actually about. There's a section where I sort of talk about the fact that people showed up on various protests with these signs that said, sort of after 2016, 2017, if Hillary had won, we'd be at brunch right now. And I sort of feel like the danger is with this kind of current in terms of what's happened with the US election, and I suppose to a lesser extent with the vaccine, that now we have permission from Joe and Kamala and from Pfizer to just go back to brunches. And actually, we need to sort of understand that if we try to return to normal, we are basically going to come back to the same very similar political problems that we have been sort of shielding ourselves from, or most of us have been sort of cowering and looking on as this kind of political monstrosity unfolds. And a lot of that has to do with what I feel has to do with what is happening to our democracy. And there's a lot, of course, that can and must be said about the far right and their explicit loathing for certain democratic institutions. But I think also we need to possibly ask ourselves whether the deconstruction of democracy on some level is something that has been mainstreamed and that is being sort of refracted through those far right voices, but also refracted through several other places as well. So, I mean, for example, I'm going to speak in some sort of crude labels in a way. This is only a way of not sort of being here all evening and sort of getting through the issue relatively quickly. But I suppose there are the category of politics that we could broadly call the neoliberals, right? And I think a lot of what I try to trace is the way that politics has produced a lot of these kind of more noticeable problems, like the Bolsonaros and the Salvinis of the world, and the sort of, in a sense, almost dialectic relationship between the two. And there are also interesting things sort of buried in the history of neoliberalism that show us that far from being a sort of single amorphous mass of political doctrine, it's actually a very kind of contradictory, flawed, body of ideas in itself, which has changed over time. To quote Mark Fisher, neoliberalism has kind of sought to eliminate the very category of value in an ethical sense. And I think one of the things that I'm kind of interested in is the way that it's basically turned everything into what I'm calling a market-driven society, where things basically don't exist or aren't valued, that can't be valued within a kind of quite, whether explicit or implicit, but a sort of free market way of thinking about life, about politics, about how government should work, about how even we should manage our private affairs, and what that really kind of has done to our ability to value aspects of the world that it turns out we really need. Things like the environment, things like democracy, things like the truth itself is somewhere in there, but also, our preparedness for things like pandemics. So there's that. And, the interesting thing there is that the original kind of founders of neoliberalism said things that really don't have much, that really go against, I think, what the kind of really most ardent neoliberals would be saying or are saying today. And one of the examples you see of this is Brexit, where, which I see basically as a sort of war of two neoliberalisms, with the kind of, you have the sort of Wolfgang Schäuble EU neoliberalism of, free movement of workers and of goods and this kind of internal marketplace kind of thing, which of course has hollowed out the economies of Southern Europe as a cost. And then you have this kind of really aggressive deregulation neoliberalism that's kind of like very hostile to the EU and is using a lot of kind of far-right tropes to kind of build legitimacy amongst certain sections of the population, using latent racisms that were already there. And so there's all of this happening, and this has this kind of multi-decade history through Thatcher and various other kind of, a whole network of think tanks and stuff like that. And then we also have what we could call the moderates or the liberals or the centrists. These politicians a bit like Biden and Macron and Starmer, who probably, in terms of some of the things they favor, aren't very different from the neoliberals. I have an aunt who's fond of saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I feel like part of the difference is simply the kind of discursive or sort of conscious intentions of these people who really believe that their policies are about making the world better and fairer and all the rest of it. But actually, this is a very narrow and selective and rather hypocritical way of approaching that problem that masks and erases most one of the more important parts of that, which of course is economic policies like progressive taxation and better social programs and things like that. And the interesting thing there, and this is one of the things I took from your work, Aurelien, is the way in which this acts in a sort of dance with the far right by providing language and ideation and so forth, and even in this kind of mutual scapegoating that's going on, that the far right then jumps on with their kind of social conservatism and racism and xenophobia that they've long had. So I think the more we try to embrace this kind of slippery but liberal politics that seems like such a reprieve after the years of Donald Trump, the more we probably will end up falling back into the kind of corollary of that, which is more Trumps.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's why I found your book so incredibly interesting. In a way, as I said at the beginning, I would have been very happy for you to just look at fake news, and how fake news kind of worked. I think it would have been a great book as well. But I think you went far beyond that, and you touched on all these issues that kind of, to me, linked to some of the work that I've been doing. And I wish, in a way, your book had come out, earlier, because there's plenty of it. But I could have, with Aaron, but we could.
Your book had come out earlier, so I could have treated that in.
Yeah, next time we'll have to plan it better, maybe.
Yeah.
But what I really like about it is how you kind of don't let the kind of moderates, so you don't let the liberals or even the left off the hook in a way, and you kind of like you don't put simply the responsibility on Trump, on fake news, on those who create fake news, from different places, and kind of you look at where they're coming from and how they're not just this kind of extreme, this kind of monster, this kind of illiberal, kind of movement, ideologies or whatever, but they're actually very much part and parcel of the kind of liberal monster to some extent, of what liberalism has allowed to happen. And it's interesting that you talk a lot about neoliberalism. And to me, when you talked about neoliberalism, even though I saw why you were using neoliberalism, I felt that you're also talking about liberalism in a way, and the failure of liberalism to kind of to deal with its own failures and its intrinsic failures, and the way it has kind of hollowed out our democracies and so on, and how there's much more to Trump than Trump himself. There's much more to Trump than fake news. There's much more to Trump than his kind of tweets in a way. Like Trump is the product of the last 30, 40 years. And this is what you kind of look at there in a lot of depth in your book. So I was wondering if you could kind of expand on this kind of idea that really Trump, Brexit are not exceptional monsters that will go away and we will move on, but they're very much kind of like where we're at now and a logical conclusion of the last 40 years.
Well, I mean, exactly. So I guess, when you write your first book, you kind of get out all the things you've been waiting to say for a long time. And then that came out, and then, or rather that was finished and handed to the publishers. And then the very kind of 3 weeks later or something, Trump won the US election. And I was like, oh my God, here we go all over again. And I was sort of, in a sense, I perhaps this is an off-color joke, but I think of myself as having been sort of re-radicalized by that moment and having suddenly then a whole lot more to say. But the book is very much, okay, so if you look at, Google Trends to see who is searching for what when, you'll see that the phrase fake news spikes about 3 weeks after Trump won the 2016 election. And so it was sort of at that moment that I realized there was a huge amount more to say. And I felt like we need obviously to respond, to the politics that Trump represented. But I also wanted to respond to the response that immediately provoked, because the thing about fake news and it's the kind of spiking of it's people searching for it then is obviously when surprising and shocking things happen, people search for answers. And I had been writing about social media and really kind of taking issue with the ways that people try to explain compulsive social media use without looking at some of the kind of, cultural features of late capitalism. And I don't really think that you can talk about a problem like that without understanding the reality that people face. And so I was already kind of annoyed by the ways that people erase or don't talk about really key parts of the problem and of the kind of, the world in which we're existing. And then along came this quite sort of, shocking event, to some people, surprising event. And I saw the same thing happen again, that people responded to Trump's victory in 2016 by trying to blame technology, by trying to, as you say, point at the far right as if they were some sort of pathology that came out of nowhere. And, without for one second wanting to provide any sort of justification or kind of legitimacy for those things whatsoever, I think it's really important that if we want to genuinely make them go away, we have to not be disingenuous and selective in our trying to kind of account for what has actually driven them. And one of the key patterns I see is a sort of, this kind of Fukuyama-esque moment in which we kind of crown capitalism king of the world and then refuse to talk about its various problems. And it's still kind of, okay, there's this sort of thing that at parties or with I don't know, people you don't know well, you're not supposed to talk about, what is it, politics, family, and religion. Well, I feel like actually, to a certain extent, you're not allowed to talk about cultural or economic systems either. And I know this because I've done this at parties, and it's like, that man over there is talking about capitalism too much. But actually, we really need to be having those conversations, and we sort of have them within a left-wing bubble. But what I realize is it is a feature of those systems, liberalism and neoliberalism, that they are incapable of addressing or talking about their own weaknesses. That is itself something that makes them so likely to end in disaster. That failure of reflexivity is a form of blindness that kind of makes them much more damaging. In a sense, if you start out with something that looks like kind of liberalism, but it kind of is able to mend itself and fix itself and make itself more just and make itself, not, I don't know, dog whistle the far right in the ways that it had been doing or whatever, then perhaps I would have less of a problem with it. When it says it's, LGBT friendly and multicultural and feminist, I would believe it if it was able to kind of fix itself in this way. But I saw this total lack of reflexivity, and that was not only part of what led us to the moment of Trump and these various other outcomes that Brexit and other things that we could associate with that time period, but also that constituted a kind of, in a sense, a kind of fake news in itself, a kind of misinformational phenomenon that needed to be unpicked more. This is the failure of a system to adjust to its own weaknesses or flaws is misinformation, in my view.
That leads quite well to my next question. And I think, it's interesting how you talk about misinformation here and how you talk about it as well in the book. And I totally agree with the way you kind of frame all of this. And a lot of the work that I've done on populism, for example, looks at exactly this, how populism has been kind of created to kind of, put pressure away from actually the center, the moderates, the liberals and their failures. And then, you just blame populists on the left and right as if they were the same, the kind of horseshoe theory.
Exactly.
And you look at these issues in the book, and what I really like as well about it is that the way you talk about fake news, because I said at the beginning that I really wanted, and I've said it twice now, that I really wanted you to talk about fake news, but I think you talk about it in a very interesting manner, and you don't fall into the kind of into what you would expect from a lot of books on fake news in a way, this idea that all you're going to look at are conspiracy theories, the thing that kind of sells, of course, but that doesn't really explain the moment we live in, I think, or that only explains part of it. So I'm wondering whether you could actually talk a bit more about fake news, which is, the aim of the book, really. What is fake news? Is fake news new? What is fake news, information, disinformation, misinformation? All the terms that kind of you use throughout the book, which I think really help to eliminate the context we live in at the moment really, really well. So if you could discuss that a bit, that'd be great.
For sure. Well, I suppose I should. I'm indebted to so many great thinkers to write this book, so it's impossible to name everyone. But I suppose in terms of learning how to problematize the term fake news, there's a scholar called Claire Wardle who did that very early and very well. And so she's mentioned on, I think, page 1 of the book, literally, because that's the place to start. Fake news as a term is interesting because, of course, it constitutes itself a form of misinformation. In fact, there's a line in there somewhere: fake news is fake news. But we sort of need to, as you say, we need to kind of delve into that and look a bit more at what that is. I guess I saw a kind of a three-way relationship between three things. We saw in kind of November 2016 this kind of parallel process. Well, yeah, I guess all three things are kind of happening simultaneously. So I'm not quite sure which order to tell you them in, but let's say for a start, we have these kinds of so-called populists, these kind of, I mean, Trump especially, I think, and actually one of the earliest uses was the police, fraternal order of police in the US, who had made some accusation, they dismissed some accusation against them as fake news. And then, of course, Trump's team were using this term fake news to dismiss legitimate criticism of their, things they had said in public or whatever, policies they were planning to enact, as they were dismissing this as fake news. And this is something that is not just a US phenomenon. It's spread really across at least the English-speaking world. I would be curious to know whether fake news has become a loan word in any non-English speaking places. But I think actually in Brazil, I've seen it used in sort of in quotes in Portuguese. So there's this kind of way of escaping accountability. But the reason that's possible is because of a completely, well, I guess, a tangentially related problem, which was this kind of trying to make sense of the rise of those kinds of political moments from the people who didn't agree with them. Mostly, I guess, some of the left and most of this kind of liberal group that we're talking about, who looked on aghast at, at Trump's ascent to power and Brexit, and said, this has happened because of a phenomenon called fake news, which is basically false news stories that are circulated around the internet, mostly for money, to make money from Google AdWords. They figured out that news values can work even if the news itself is untrue. That if you make the most surprising possible news article, you can make a lot of money from hits, more money than the actual journalism industry can make from hits quite often, from a single story, sometimes up to $10,000 just by sharing this. Sharing this one piece. And in the end, we discovered that some of that apparently comes from Macedonia in Velish, and some of it is being done within the US. But there was this kind of this phenomenon, and true to form, this kind of liberal center decided that the problem must be technology. The technology has enabled Donald Trump in this way, and it's this kind of technological pathology of fake news that is the problem. And so they, in a way, are responsible for mainstreaming that term and making it available for then, Trump and other people who are part of that same moment to then use it in that dismissive way.
And we see the same with Brexit, of course.
Absolutely. Although there was initially less talking about Brexit with the language of fake news, but then once it happened with Trump, then it was used retrospectively to talk about Brexit as well. And obviously some of the kind of outcry around scandals like Cambridge Analytica is also part of that as well, although of course that really is quite scandalous. But then the third part was, and I know this because I've been teaching in journalism departments for going on 12 years, something like that, I mean, there's a lot of fantastic journalism out there, but there's also an awful lot of like shoddy, lazy journalism that is kind of quite complacent about it and quite happy to dog whistle the far right and to be very kind of complicit with those same forms of unreflexivity that were kind of common in that post-Cold War kind of capitalist democracy that we've been discussing. And so when if all the journalism was great, then you could sort of respond to the charge of fake news. Well, actually, look at the journalism. These journalists are all working really hard. But since so many of them kind of weren't, or there was quite a lot of bad journalism around, it's sort of that then you've added even more weight and possibility to this kind of dismissive use. And so the three problems all kind of fed into one another. Meanwhile, a lot of good journalists and a lot of people who are neither on the far right nor within this kind of moderate center were looking on aghast. And I just wanted to voice some of those criticisms really and say, like, the more you use the term fake news, the more you're basically just accelerating this kind of annoying echo of not really understanding the problem and just kind of casting it aside with a single label instead of teasing apart these different strands.
like a follow-up question on this, I think, because it's fascinating as well, and it kind of links back to what we were saying before about this idea of kind of a liberal center, or whatever we want to call it, that kind of tries to kind of divert attention away from itself in many ways. And it seems to me that fake news, as you know, really does that very well, because it kind of it creates an idea of a center as the truth, as science, as scientific, and all of these kind of things, as if it was that simple, as if there was such a thing as true news or real news. And yeah, I was wondering if you could kind of like expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things I had most fun writing actually in the whole book was my critique of, I think, what often people call positivism. So this sense of a kind of unwavering faith that people often have in these kinds of systems, you know, just the rule of law, or, you know, science, technology. And the left gets a lot of flack for pointing out that this is unwise, and that, you know, there's, you know, the idea of a singular truth that has come from a lab and that we all must now adopt is perhaps a little bit simple, because we're often blamed for the sort of fake news problem, or for, you know, for saying there is no truth, even though A, that isn't what we're saying, and B, we haven't really had power over the relevant time period of history in order to be able to affect our ideology anyway. But yeah, so this kind of way of thinking about ideas that I guess you know, we normally call positivism. I think of Anatole France, the rich and poor alike are forbidden from begging and sleeping under the bridges of Paris. You know, actually, it sort of doesn't really address the kinds of injustices that are often built into those systems, or the ways in which that science has, you know, frequently been wheeled out to be anything but progressive. I mean, we could think of more recently oil companies hiring scientists to, you know, who perhaps figured out that climate change is going to be a serious problem, but then were sort of employed to help suppress that information. Or same with tobacco companies. And also, then you could go back further and look at kind of Nazi science and things like that. But there's lots of examples of in science. And same, I mean, the kind of centrality of technology, whether it's in part of people's kind of criticism of what's happening in the world, or part of the solutions that they envision, is another version of that. Like, the answer is always, oh, well, we just need to, you know, create some better technologies, pass some better laws, and perhaps put more funding into STEM and science, and our problems will just magically go away, because these are the kind of, it's basically just the Enlightenment, but sort of like neo-Enlightenment values, you know? And obviously this is another way, as you point out, this is another way for the system to not really have to examine itself by pretending it isn't a system. The systems are all over there. There are other systems we need to look at and invest in, but not the kind of economic systems, or systems of taxation, or systems of international trade, or anything else that might also be a part of that. But also, it's a way of not looking at ideology, right, or even understanding the true meaning of that word, and what it means for a bunch of people in a society to all believe unwittingly something that actually is damaging to that society, or holds it back. It's like, no, we don't need to have that conversation. We can just bracket that and talk about these kinds of things that can be fixed with money or technology, usually. And that is a kind of misinformation that I find particularly vexing, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, how you talk about it as a return to the Enlightenment, and it's exactly that, right? There's reason, and there's this reason, almost like there's the kind of, you know, the kind of darkness and dark ages, and we have reason, but that shouldn't be kind of improved or questioned or criticized in any way, shape, or form. But then there's the flip side of the coin, and you talk about this as well in the book, which is the reactionary argument that gains massive credence because of this kind of totally flawed positioning of liberal center as reason, which is the marketplace of ideas. You know, if you debate ideas, then, you know, the truth will come out, and good ideas will prevail, and nasty ideas will be demolished in debate, and therefore we should be able to debate absolutely everything. So yeah. I was wondering if you could talk about this a bit as well.
Well, yeah, I guess. So, I mean, one of the questions that I really wanted to explore also is kind of, why were we so vulnerable to misinformation in the first place? You know, if a fake news story comes along claiming that, I don't know, Pope Francis has endorsed Donald Trump or something, or the Amish movement, the Amish lobby is pushing for Donald Trump. Why do people believe this? And I suppose, you know, one of the conclusions I came to is that there's a way in which certain presumptions are made about those Enlightenment systems, made by those Enlightenment systems, about what kind of population would be participating in these debates and what sort of readiness we would have and what sort of vulnerabilities or not we might have in order to be able to do that. And it's, you know, it's very hard to make these kinds of arguments without sounding like you're making an elitist or sort of paternalistic argument. But I didn't want to say, well, I'm the one who has all the information and you all are kind of illiterate or not capable of having reasoned discussion. But I did want to say that in a way, you can't really have the forms of sort of, I don't know, of debate and free marketplace of ideas and you know, even I guess the concept of freedom of speech in a way and who's platformed and who isn't become relevant if you can't really agree about what the boundaries of that discourse are. And if there are kind of really kind of outlandish conspiracy theories like QAnon or you know, birtherism in the United States that are then afforded both a platform and legitimacy because they're written up in the pages of The Economist or something like this. Actually, whether you were attacking them or sort of giving them a platform doesn't really matter, because actually the population as a whole is susceptible to believing them enough of the time that you sort of make this you know, John Stuart Mill idea of of rational debate producing the right answer into, you know, I mean, Jason Stanley, the American philosopher, has written about this really well, that it sort of breaks the whole system really when you try to do that. But I think that there's another way in which this also, this idea of I guess, Enlightenment values producing the opposite outcome in terms of the way that they're used in discourse, kind of, they sort of counteract themselves, which is something that I saw in your work too, I think, which is a sense that actually when you use the values of the Enlightenment to attack certain groups of population who you see as unenlightened or you want to cast as unenlightened in some way, you actually then enable forms of illiberal racism and so forth that you consider to be possibly your enemy. And so there's, in terms of the free marketplace of ideas, in a sense, as long as I argue a kind of rational liberal argument, I can never be doing anything wrong, is shown to be misguided in that way also.
Absolutely, and incredibly dangerous in many ways. I'm aware of time, and I'm sure that there'll be questions as well from the audience. So I'd like to move to my kind of final point of discussion, which is something that's quite close to my heart, because that's something that I'm turning my attention to in my kind of new research as well. Like I've spent a bit like you, I guess, in a way, you know, I spent the last kind of decade or a bit more even kind of looking at the far right, looking at the mainstreaming of the far right, looking at racism, like a lot of kind of grim stuff, you know, kind of mapping in a way the kind of reactionary moment we live in, the reactionary context we live in. And, you know, after the kind of the book we wrote with Aaron, after publishing it, I felt like I just needed something else. I needed, in a way, to stop reacting. I felt like I spent the last decade reacting to the far right, reacting to the kind of, you know, slow slip into racism, into the mainstreaming of racism, into the return of kind of eugenics, into the return of kind of, you know, things that we felt had gone to some extent, rightly or wrongly, and most likely wrongly. So I'd like us to then talk a bit more about solutions. And I mean, I'm not going to ask you to, you know, find solutions to our reactionary moment, you know, but I'd like us to kind of think about why does the left always seem to be reacting to Trump, to Brexit, to white supremacy, and how can we find kind of more hopeful emancipatory futures in many ways? How can we escape this kind of binary between the liberal center, which we have to defend because the alternative seems a lot worse, but at the same time, the liberal center is so incredibly problematic and feeds into that reactionary alternative. And so us fighting the reactionary alternative, we end up legitimizing the center, which is just not great either. So how do we escape this?
Well, as you say, it's a phenomenal task to kind of flesh that out in entirety. I too am thinking about that as far as what my next projects might be, but I think it's sort of okay. How can I put this? I mean, part of the tactics maybe that we need to adopt are in not necessarily always screaming from the rooftops about what we're going to do, and I think that that word is sort of key. I was talking to a friend one evening quite recently about how, in some ways, disillusioned I feel about the left's approach to many of these problems, because we end up, I feel that we have been on the right side of history and we do have the moral high ground, and I feel that those are positions to keep. But I also feel that signing petitions and going on demonstrations and writing books are not enough. And so, I guess one approach might be, well, let's look at what those who do have power have been doing. And obviously we don't have, we don't have billions of dollars on our side most of the time. We don't have, states on our side a lot of the time. We don't have guns and those kinds of things, and we don't believe in using them either. So, those are all kind of off the menu, so to speak. But I think that there are other things that one could say. You could look at, for instance, the kind of enormous proliferation of institutions, groups, various kinds of organizations that has occurred in the last 40 to 50 years, particularly amongst the kind of free market lobby, and that has enabled the sort of, anti-authoritarian neoliberalism of the 1930s and 40s, of Hayek to kind of mutate into the very dominant and very aggressive post-Thatcher neoliberalism that we are seeing in the kind of elite Brexit movement. And obviously we don't want to end up like that, but one of the things we could do, for instance, is create a lot more institutions that can kind of hold on to the progress that we make, so that when one person leaves or one person moves on, that progress is retained in that kind of network of institutions. It's always amusing to me that we're accused, the public sphere, the kind of mainstream culture is accused of having a left-wing bias, and I'm just like, I wish, but I think that actually one of the things we could do is be a bit more tactical about kind of coming together around organizations. We're very good at thinking about and theorizing about collective ownership and alternative models and stuff like that. But when it comes to actually putting that into practice and building a left-wing world using our bare hands and our creative ingenuity and a MacBook Pro here or there, but not much else, we don't seem to have the time. Part of it, I think, is a sort of fatigue question, and it's a very daunting way to live, to wake up every morning and say, what can we do? And I see a lot of paralysis on the left, which I think is entirely understandable, and I wouldn't fault it for a second. But I think my mission has been trying to sort of slowly, hopefully not like some sort of creepy missionary, but slowly try to bring some of my friends into kind of singular conversations and say, maybe let's build more institutions and let's make more things happen together. Not just, edited volumes are great in academia, but I mean, there's a sort of mass out there. I think for those of us that work in academia, we always have to pinch ourselves and remind us that there's so much more out there, that so much of this publicly funded research that we're doing isn't necessarily reaching some of the people who might find it the most useful. There's not a very clear answer in a way, but I think institution building and grouping together is one thing that really does need to happen. I was interviewed by Novara not so long ago, and they asked me this question, and I had just been reading an article on squads and the importance of building squads, more informal, smaller groups, that are maybe oriented around a specific purpose. So that's one thing. But I guess I want to come back to what I said about tactics, because, this thing of always banging the drum about how sort of morally correct you are, I think so there's a place for that. And I think that there's really important role for kind of shaping the discourse and so forth. But when I look at the kind of shift in power that's happened in the last few years, I see a very gradual shift. Wendy Brown calls it neoliberalism's stealth revolution. And so I think one of the things we should maybe be open to, and this is not the same as the liberal argument of like, I agree in the goal that you seek, but you are pushing too hard. We're going to push very hard, but maybe we don't always tell the world about what we're doing, and we don't always announce how left-wing we are, given how discredited to many of the public, those ideas may seem for a lot of reasons. I mean, actually, one of the things that's interesting to me, and again is in the book, is the way that the right have tried to tell the story of left-wing history, or what they say is left-wing history, and they look at the most kind of violent Soviet communist, movements in Europe and say, oh, well, this is why left-wingers can't be trusted. And there's a group of people, including Thomas Borick, I think, who was the chief data architect of the Brexit campaign, and others. I've done some digging, who are trying to open a museum of communism, or they were before the pandemic, because they wanted to be the ones to tell the story of what supposedly communism is. Now, it may not even be helpful to use the word communism for us anymore if those things are successful. But I also think that, power belongs to those who control what is normal. And in some sense, I would love us to maybe have a try at normalizing our ideas rather than always kind of labeling them and making them marked, because you can sign yourself immediately back out of the power seat when you do that, I think.
And it's fascinating because it's exactly what the far right did in the 70s and 80s, when they realized that biological racism wouldn't sell anymore. They borrowed Gramsci. So they actually borrowed our theories. And, then they used the whole kind of like cultural power before political power and changed to kind of, cultural racism and all these things.
Precisely. I mean, I was really struck to learn that Andrew Breitbart had said, politics flows downstream from culture, or that Hayek had said to Anthony Fisher, the founder of the IEA, if you want to change things, you must change ideas. Politics is nothing by itself.
Yeah, I mean, the French Nouvelle Droite as well. Like they did borrow Gramsci and were quoting Gramsci, which is dispiriting, really, when they understand it better than we do sometimes.
Oh, that's fascinating. I didn't know that as well. But I think there's probably a whole project one could do, or maybe someone is doing, just on how the far right across the world have borrowed these kinds of left-wing, approaches.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that as well I saw in your book, which I think really spoke to me, because like one of the things that gives me hope as well, and I think you're right about kind of institutions and about kind of reinventing ourselves as well and reinventing our discourse. And one of the things that gives me hope when things are so dark to some extent, and particularly were so dark, and I think even though Biden is not perfect, I think we should still kind of we can breathe a sigh of relief, because things will be a bit better for people at the sharp end, at least, of Trump's politics. But I think it's still very dark. And when things are so dark, for me, the thing that kind of gives me hope and gives me a bit of optimism is the contingency of things, and how contingent the system we live in is, in a way, and how it doesn't have to be this way, how there's no laws of nature that say it should be this way. And you have this quote in the book by Ursula Le Guin, which I found was absolutely brilliant. I didn't know that quote. I'd never seen it, but it's like, yeah, now it's going to be my go-to quote. It's like highlighted in the book, and like with a sticker as well, so I know where to find it. So it goes, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine rights of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." And you kind of like, so this is the start of a chapter, and in this chapter you throw a few ideas that you kind of don't necessarily buy into 100%, but I think are quite interesting. And I'd like you to explore one of them. You mentioned at some stage, what if Facebook and Twitter were owned by the people? It is an important thought experiment, you say. And then you say, well, it wouldn't be enough and we need more than that. And, it made me think of, what if Amazon was owned by the people? What if it was, nationalized and things like that? So why do you think these thought experiments are useful in a way?
Well, for a number of reasons, I suppose. What if they were publicly owned allows us to separate, I guess, the kind of very harsh and aggressive commercial imperatives that, guide their ongoing operational activities and their sort of, decisions and policies and all the rest of it from the actual kind of, I don't know what to call it, infrastructure, I suppose. And so it's like, well, we can recognize that those kinds of aggressive commercial priorities are the things that often guide the development of technologies and infrastructure to begin with. So, in a way, the reason it's a thought experiment is because you'd have to decide at what point in the development of that infrastructure you had separated off the, these commercial priorities. But of course, the problem is that you can't really make that separation because one has produced the other. So that's why it is only a thought experiment. There are, of course, places, I think, my understanding is in Argentina, for example, they don't have Amazon. They have a sort of, state equivalent, in effect, or public equivalent. But I need to learn more about that. But a friend was telling me that the other day. Certainly there are voices in the US who are saying things like that. Amazon seems a little bit more sensible in a way. The idea that that's something that could be state-owned. The problem that we run into is, I suppose, if you go back to the kind of late 70s, early 80s kind of moment where neoliberalism starts to take a hold. There's an economist, Colin Lees, who really whose work helped me learn about this. But the fact that cross-border capital controls were kind of eliminated means that obviously capital becomes a global force. So exactly how you do these things without doing them everywhere at the same time, again, introduces a complexity into this, because it's not like the railways where you can just nationalize them tomorrow if you wanted to, unless you're going to actually prohibit other kinds of competitive entrance into those markets. It's hard really to know where that could go, but I think there's possibility in that if the thing about Amazon, at least, or these kinds of surveillance capitalism giants, is that they're so large, it would to compete with them at this point, you would have to take a state or something like that in order to kind of have any chance of success. But that could be, if we really want to let ourselves think, then a state Amazon would be able to pay people properly and eliminate the profit incentive, and be merged with a newly nationalized or fully nationalized Royal Mail and all of those kinds of things. And one can dream, a boy can dream, but it's nice to think about them, but I can't really see ways to jump from the world we're in to those possibilities yet.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and it's really something that I found really, really interesting. And I think that quote again from Mr. Le Guin is, makes it, even though it seems completely unreal to think about these things, right? The fact that throughout history things seemed completely unreal, and then they changed, and it needed, like what some people have called an event, for example, something that you can't foresee, but then it happened, and that's when you need to be faithful to it, and you need to kind of go for it. But
quite. And the sort of, in a way, there's a broader point here about when changes occur. And obviously I was saying about this kind of slow cultural normalization kind of process as well, but I think it's also worth acknowledging, for instance, the work of Naomi Klein on the idea of shock doctrine, in the way that this is a sort of Friedmanite idea, really, that when sudden and shocking things come along, there is an opportunity for quite rapid change. And the pandemic in some ways possibly represents, according to some more optimistic interpretations, represents a possibility for the left to offer its ideas in a way that perhaps it's not had an opportunity to do for quite a while. And there's a degree of reorganization of the world post-pandemic that will undoubtedly take place. And we can just push ideas. We don't have to say again that they're left-wing ideas. We can just know that they are. And so that's a possibility. And also when I think about Brexit, I remember being at law school in Birkbeck at sort of maybe 2011 or 2012, and we were sat in a kind of EU law seminar, and we were talking about Article 50 and what happens when states want to leave, and how no state has ever tried to leave. And we were talking about what the closest possible imagined version of that could be. And I think it was about, well, Greenland is part of Denmark, and so if they seceded, then technically they would be leaving the EU. And that was the kind of, and one person mentioned, I think, the kind of idea of Britain leaving. But it really seemed like to think of that as being even remotely possible was just kind of, I don't know, inconceivable. It really, that was a thought experiment then. And then, what, 6 years later, 5 years later, it happened. And it happened because, of course, you know, there was a long-term sort of push to, I mean, from the 70s, really early 70s, there was a Eurosceptic push to get Britain out of the common market more or less as soon as it joined. And so I guess maybe these things are long-term, but also if you look at the way that Farage et al. Have kind of made that into a mainstream issue and made that something that the kind of Conservative Party couldn't get away from, then, I mean, I don't know, again, it's hard to see ways that the left can do that now, but I'm sure that those opportunities are in there somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the same for Trump as well. I mean, who would have thought even in 2015 that Trump could be president, right? So how quickly these things change.
I guess one thing to say also is that US politics in this regard seems a little brighter in some ways, because, I mean, if you look at what's happened there, you know, there's long been this kind of uneasy standoff between a sort of centrist party and then a kind of conservative, effectively right-wing party, or some bits of it. And then some politicians have come along. Some of, like Bernie Sanders, have been doing this for a long time, quietly pushing, but others like AOC or the Justice Democrats, who kind of stand behind her and helped elect others like Cori Bush, have made policies like Medicare for All that were completely, even Hillary Clinton tried to bring something similar in, you know, decades ago, and it didn't, I mean, it's still not going very well, but they've mainstreamed those ideas in a way that, you know, I lived in the US for many years, and I would never have foreseen that would be quite so quick as they've done that.
So there is hope then. That's good.
There is hope, yeah.
So we're going to turn to the questions now. So please do put in your questions in the little chat box as well. The first one is from Alistair Keynes. Thought experiments aside, what might we focus on to try to curtail this phenomenon? Don't be a bore at parties. We probably won't nationalize Facebook, etc. So what can we do practically?
When we say curtail this phenomenon, I'm assuming we mean this kind of symbiosis between this kind of stodgy, you know, dullness as a virtue kind of center and then the far right.
That's what that's how I understand it as well. But if Alistair wants to clarify, go ahead, please. But yeah, if he wants to start answering like this. Yeah.
How can we stop it? I mean, Alistair, how long have you got? I've tried once, probably not very well, to float some answers here. And you know, I suppose, as I say, building a new network of you know, credible left-wing institutions to kind of, you know, crowdfund and to change the discourse, and to sort of think tactically about what are, you know, some of the victories that we can bring about and how to bring about the more difficult ones, and to kind of bring great minds together and foster more conversations on a strategic level, I think is a big part of that. You know, there's this old Milton Friedman quote about, as I was saying, about making sure your ideas are lying around appropriately. So then when, you know, when the shock comes along, people will reach for whatever they can find to try to kind of fix, you know, fix the problem. And so this is something that we can do. I think we're so desperate for answers that sometimes we tend to kind of run before we can walk. And I really hesitate to say that, but I think that sometimes if you provoke a backlash, you can set back the cause. It really depends so much on the cause and on the context, right? Because there are also elements where I think that's an inappropriate criticism. For example, I mean, with the environmental crisis, you know, a lot of people say, oh, Extinction Rebellion shouldn't be shutting down airports and making people's holidays bad because that just loses them, you know. And, you know, maybe jumping on a busy tube in Canning Town and as people are trying to get to work, you know, working people are trying to get to work, is not a very good idea. But actually disrupting the system is something that has always been a part of how we brought about radical change. And then there's a degree of that we need to be doing, probably more than we're doing rather than less. So, you know, there's the kind of sly institutional arm of what the left needs to do. Excuse me. And then there's also this kind of quite radical arm as well. In a way, we can build our own symbiosis, our own dialectic between the two, rather than just having this one approach.
Yeah, brilliant. There's lots of questions now that have come up. I was looking at the wrong chat, so don't worry, I haven't forgotten your questions. Fake news is indeed used in Italy. There you go. We were talking about that earlier on. There's a few questions about how we can turn the tide, so we've looked at them. But if you want to, we'll go back to them a bit later. One that we haven't talked about so much, you've touched on it during our conversation, is what is the role of journalists? What can journalists do? And those that's with a stake in the news and I guess in public discourse generally in fighting these trends.
Well, it's funny. I was chatting recently to a friend about this, and I feel like in a way, it's going to take a while for the credibility of journalism to be rebuilt. But in a sense, we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that we can just fix systems like journalism and technology and we'll fix the problem, because those things are really only mediating other forms of the same issue that we're talking about. Journalists are complicit in something, but they're not causing it necessarily. They might be prolonging it or making it worse or failing to challenge it. And all of those things need to be fixed. And, that's why, in a sense, why I love the job of educating journalists and working in the journalism department, even though I'm not myself a journalist, is in helping journalists to see and understand the workings of power and to be able to kind of do that job in a way that is kind of awake as to the workings of power and sufficiently endowed with the ability to challenge them better. And the great journalists out there in the world who are doing this, whether it's investigative stuff or just kind of really great kind of, I'm not going to use the word objective because I don't really believe that's possible, but actually kind of making a more honest attempt to appraise what the facts are. Even facts in a way is a kind of positivist construction, but I'm sort of checking myself here. But, if journalists became more literate about power and more kind of willing to challenge power in the forms it actually takes and to see the alliance, for instance, of corporate and governmental power as one thing and one problem, then I think that would be a big start.
Yeah, there's plenty more to say about this, but yeah, brilliant answer. We have another question on, which is quite long, so I'm going to try and summarize it, about mysticism and neo-spiritualism and the left, and whether that has a role to play in a way. So that question is from Chris Papaioannou, and whether mysticism on the left has a role to play in a way.
I mean, sure. I mean, I think the left must be, pluralistic and inclusive and sort of practice what we preach. I think it's sometimes when you're faced with such disempowerment, it's very easy to be kind of solutionistic and focus on like dismissing everything that doesn't represent an immediate answer. But as you can see, finding immediate answers is an extremely difficult process. So actually, there are all sorts of forms of self-care and exploratory thinking and collective thinking that need to be explored. And I mean, I'm not very qualified to evaluate specifically the forms that this question suggests, but I think, of course, there's a role for that to play.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating, and in a way, it goes back to some of the things we discussed before about contingency and hope to some extent. When you're faced with such what seems like such a block, like something that seems insurmountable in a way, and I think it does require some faith to some extent, right? But things can be different, and also some faith that if change happens and you decide to go with it, then you need, and you want to create a new world, you don't really know where it's going to go, and so it's a kind of faith to an event in a way, as kind of like Alain Badiou talked about, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, you're making me think of two things actually. One is a Horkheimer quote I saw recently, which is, I do not think things will improve, but the idea that they might is of crucial importance. And I suppose that connects in some ways with the kind of Gramscian idea of, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. But also certain wise people who I'm very close to have kind of always instructed me that even if we had a revolution tomorrow, we would have to work even harder the day after that, because there's no such thing as a sort of there's no safety. There's no like end of the race. Like, okay, now world domination, you know, egalitarian left world has been built. No, there'll always be a challenge to protect that, even when we do have you know, victories. And so a degree of kind of optimism and faith, and also self-care in that, I think is essential.
Mm-hmm. Another question that builds on something we touched on briefly, which is about the why has the specter of the silencing of free speech been so profoundly successful? Yeah, I mean, there's a very long question. Beyond the brutal cynicism of the political operatives who mobilize these fears, to what do we attribute the startling success of these discourses, seemingly among wide cross sections of the polity, who otherwise hadn't seemed to care very much about the vitality of public debate before now? I mean, that's a huge question, and it's something that really gets me upset. So I'll let you go, Marcus.
It is. I'd really love to hear what you have to say, Aurelien, as well. And don't let me hog this question. I suppose it's, in a way, it's kind of an interesting playing of exactly these. It's a good example of how these kinds of Enlightenment sounding values can appear to be extremely, you know, righteous sounding. You know, freedom of expression is, after all, a human right, which is protected in the European Convention and all the rest of it. Who could argue with that? So it's got this kind of bulletproof character to it. But then, of course, you know, that's the strength that it has. And then it's used like a sort of surgical scalpel to be applied to amplifying very specific voices. So, you know, people who are not platformed are being deprived somehow of a human right, even though that's not for a moment how human rights actually work, because you can still say what you want somewhere else. Meanwhile, at the same time, those who speak up in some way and criticize, or use their freedom of expression to criticize, or perhaps, you know, challenge these same voices that would otherwise be amplified, are then accused of limiting that freedom of speech. So it kind of works both as an amplifier over here and also as a kind of suppressor of something of the opposite side of the dialogue. Not that there is only two sides, but you know what I mean. And that's, I think, whether or not it was intended and envisioned this way, I think it's been a genius strategy, because it's this thing that sounds reasonable, but actually is extremely unreasonable and selective. And, you know, what I guess, I don't think I said this earlier, but one of the things I really hate, which again is what this sort of book is about, is beware the things that seem like they're solutions or seem like they're righteous in some way, but are the opposite. Beware the non-solution that sounds like it's building a better world, but isn't. And freedom of speech is a very good way of pulling the so-called persuadables onto your side. It's a good way that we can see sort of centrist discourse being used to kind of great effect by people who actually really don't believe in freedom of speech at all, and want to make their case for a very, very dark world. Have I been cut off? Or, I think we lost Aurelien momentarily. You're muted.
Sorry, I got scared. My internet died all of a sudden. It's back.
Well, you froze perfectly and in a particular expression, and I was worried I had said something very bemusing, or
But you really upset me, and I left, like, slammed the door. I dropped the mic and slammed the door. No, I'm back, and yeah. Sorry, had you finished or?
No, I had finished. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I think I only missed just a tiny bit of what you were saying. I completely agree. I think it's absolutely fascinating, the hypocrisy behind the free speech argument, and that's what gets me so worked up in a way. And as you were saying, how it kind of pretends that some voices are being censored, even though these voices are heard absolutely everywhere, you know, in mainstream media, even on the center left. And then at the same time, it's using free speech to censor the people who are just criticizing, so who are just exercising their free speech. And yeah, I think it's been, as you said, it's been quite a genius strategy. And I don't know how planned it was, as you were saying, but certainly now they know that it works. And I think it also speaks, it doesn't just speak to how clever the reactionaries have been, but I think it also speaks to how lazy and void of ideas the center has become. The fact that they buy into it, the fact that some people who should know better, who I think fairly genuinely oppose the far right, for example, will end up signing letters defending the right of far right people to speak. Even though these people have already the right to speak and speak all the time. You know, I mean, it reminds me of the media landscape in France, where we have Islamophobes day in, day out, front page of newspapers, of magazines, on the radio, on TV, all the time. And yet all the media is like, Islam is a big taboo. You can't talk about Islam in France. And they put that, they plaster that, you know, on front pages. And it's, I mean, you know, these people should know better, because a lot of these newspaper editors, like, they are against these ideas, and yet they just fall.
They fall for it.
Them either. So,
yeah,
which is fascinating. Which leads me to one of the other questions in a way of whether advertisement has replaced news to some extent.
I wouldn't say well, it depends what you mean, actually. Let's because, you know, we need to, I guess one of the things we haven't really talked about so much is surveillance capitalism and the attention economy, which obviously has a very important role to play, because it is the marketization of, you know, or the commodification of certain aspects of our public spheres that were not previously an area for capitalism to derive surplus value in the same way. And so, I mean, this is something me and my students talk about a lot. But the sense that when I'm posting, you know, on, let's say I post on Facebook, hey everyone, you know, here's a book that I've written, please, you know, share it and help me out, blah, blah, blah. What I think I'm doing is sharing with my friends, but what I'm actually doing really is providing a further incentive for people to continue checking that, that system. And of course, as the famous saying goes, if it's free, you're the product. What actually is being harvested there is their attention. And so it isn't so much that advertising in the classical sense has replaced journalism, but it is a sense maybe that because the things we think we're using to communicate online socially effectively amount to a form of advertising insofar as they are harvesting our attention and are mixed in with certain data-driven forms of advertising. That in effect, this kind of communication is really being replaced by advertising. But that isn't the same as journalism being replaced by advertising. Journalism, of course, is simultaneously highly dependent on advertising. Again, of this very harsh data-driven variety based on click-throughs and you know, various other metrics, but also continually undermined by it. I mean, I always sort of slightly wince when I, you know, for instance, there are certain, not that I go on the Daily Mail very often, but that's particularly bad, or the Independent is pretty bad. These websites that are so dripping with advertisement that suddenly I realize all the fans in my laptop are kind of like, are on their full power trying to keep the poor machine cool, because it's trying to render all this kind of, all these ads at the same time as, you know, show me this article which I may have clicked through from another platform which is probably also advertising driven as well. So it isn't a replacement, but it is an encroachment, I think. And it is a standoff, definitely, because journalism at the moment needs advertising, unless we're actually going to, you know, get out our wallets and fund it directly. But it also, as I say, is really undermined by advertising at the same time. Interesting kind of dialectic relationship there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a famous kind of statement from, like, I think it's probably 20 or 30 years old now, from I think it was the CEO of one of the main TV channels, private TV channels in France, who said that what he was doing was selling to advertisers brain space. So that was, you know, that was his whole kind of mission as a CEO of a TV channel was that. So I think it says a lot there.
Yeah, it's funny. I guess commodification has many forms.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's turn to, if you have more questions, we probably still have a little bit of time. Amy is commenting on this, saying that the Independent is owned by the same people who own the Daily Mail. Oh, I didn't know that. I thought the Daily Mail was Murdoch. Huh?
No, Daily Mail isn't Murdoch, but the I newspaper is directly owned by Daily Mail's owner. I'm not sure about. I think the Independent is owned by Lebedev.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, for the Independent.
which is, but I think they started the I, but I think, yeah, the I and the independent are different. That's my understanding anyway.
Towards maybe something potentially more positive, is education the solution, or is education useful? How can we turn the tide?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I'd said this earlier, but obviously education is also a big part of the solution as well. You know, which parts of the education system, and, you know, under what terms, of course, all of that can be worked out. But yes, I would say education is both, at the moment, sometimes part of the problem because of the kinds of ideological constructs it maybe normalizes, but also because it has that power, it can also be a really important part of the solution. Well, I mean, I'm curious on your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting actually. In my last lecture today, and I was talking about that and the role of education, and I mean, it depends what we mean by education, right? Whether it's emancipatory education or whether it's state-sponsored education. And it brings us back to this discussion we had before when when we were talking about whether we should nationalize Amazon or whether we should nationalize Facebook. And of course, states are problematic and have always been problematic on the left as well. The control from the state.
Absolutely. Higher education is great because, I mean, I'm not sure what your setup is, but even given all the things that are happening in higher education that are bad, I have enormous freedom in my teaching to decide what I think is an appropriate approach to, the various topics that I teach. And that is something that I really cherish and want to hold on to, particularly as, I mean, I think the week that I got my contract, after years of precarious teaching, the week that I got my full-time contract, I read Bell Hooks' Teaching to Transgress, and kind of thought about this kind of sense of education as a practice of freedom, and how different that was to certain other forms of education. And I think that as long as that's what we mean by education, then it's a huge part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we still have, as you say, we still have the space in higher education. Although I do wish that we were more kind of the cultural Marxist haven that the right talks about all the time. But it's clearly not necessarily what we are in higher education anymore. But I think what in my practice, in a way, and I do have the same freedom, and I do love teaching, but it's sometimes dispiriting to the amount of stuff that you have to deconstruct, in a way, the work you have to do to kind of deconstruct commonsensical ideas, which have been ingrained in the earlier kind of stages of education, but also fighting against that commercialization and seeing students really wanting to engage, but then at the end of the day being torn by the degree, the money they're paying for them, the need for the good mark, the need for the particular kind of grades, and how counterproductive and counterintuitive it is to any form of emancipatory education. So it's always also a struggle, which
absolutely. I mean, I often I probably shouldn't say this, but as I often in my work, I'm also an academic personal tutor for new first years, and I say to them, look, we understand the pressure to get a job after you graduate. Our statistics will show that we are successful at getting you that, if that's what you want. But for God's sake, think about whether that is what you want, because you've got your whole life ahead of you. If you want to kind of have more time to, to do something else, or to develop in other ways, then that has to be on the table also. It isn't like go and get a job immediately. In fact, nobody walks out or almost nobody walks out of a undergraduate higher education immediately gets their dream job. I celebrate those that do, but I also know that that's not been my own path, and I'm very glad of that. And it's not the path that a lot of people take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it does make me feel old, like this idea that they have to do the degree and then 21 and getting jobs. I mean, it's enormous pressure, and the fact that when you do a degree, it seems like so much money that turning around and figuring yourself out and wanting to do something else. Anyway, I think we kind of digressing slowly, but I think it's interesting. Hopefully you find it interesting as well listening. But another question, going back to bad or shoddy journalism, is there something to be said about the working conditions of journalists, and is the question of journalist labor useful?
Yes and yes. Absolutely. So I mean, I guess the best way to, so journalism, like I guess every other industry in kind of late capitalism, under the shifts that has seen in the last 50 years or so, has also seen immense change as far as the adoption of new technologies, a sort of, I guess almost you could say, Schumpeterian kind of acceleration of what journalists are expected to do. And I've seen that from, not only from teaching with quite senior journalists who have had, 30 or 40 years in industry and the kinds of experiences they've had, as contrasted with what my students can expect. But also even over the 10 years or so that I've been teaching, a real change there as far as the kinds of labor that people aspire to, whether you could just go and be a writer, from off the back of a journalism master's, or whether you needed to do what we sometimes call Vishnu journalism, have many arms and basically be able to do everything: computer-assisted reporting, investigative kind of jigsaw investigation, feature writing, news writing, podcasting, all of these things. And it's definitely been a shift in that direction. So all of that constitutes pressure, I think, on journalists as workers and laborers, and that's something that I think they deserve our full kind of support and compassion in. But I think it's also worth saying something about the kind of makeup of who gets to go into journalism if you're going to consider them as workers, because you sort of have to be, for that to work, you have to be working with people who consider themselves as workers in terms of their ontology, and that means a certain kind of, left-wing way of looking at it, where actually, not where I teach now so much, but where I used to teach in London, it was very kind of middle class, and a lot of people who could sort of afford to do a year of unpaid internship and then probably go and have a column at the Telegraph or suddenly be an anchor on Sky News. And, unfortunately, that is one of the problems that, some of the problems I've been describing in journalism in terms of its complicity in this market-driven society and so forth, have come about because of its extreme centering on the kind of, essentially white middle class of Britain. As for other countries, I'm not sure whether that's similarly the case. One would suspect so, but I at least know in US journalism, it seems slightly better. I mean, there are other problems there, but not quite so much that one. So, yes, we can kind of support people as workers and maybe take away some of that precarity, but they have to want and help us build a world where that is both possible and desired by most people.
Yeah, that's a great answer. We probably have a time for one more question if anyone is a quick typer. Otherwise, is there anything that you would like to add, Marcus, to conclude? I have something to add, actually, to wait while if anyone is
please go ahead
to ask one last question. There's this great book that you can buy if you haven't bought it yet. Hopefully you bought it when you registered for this event, but if you haven't bought it, that's a great Christmas present to all your friends and family, and amazing to talk about around a Christmas table. You can be the awkward guest that Marcus was talking about before.
Thank you so much, Aurelien. I would hold up your book, but I have it in ebook copy, so I have it, but I can't brandish it in the same way. But it's also, you should all, Aurelien has written a book with Aaron Winter on the far right and reactionary democracy is what it's called. And everybody should also, if you're interested in these questions that we've been talking about, definitely read that as well. It's excellent.
Well, thank you, Marcus. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thanks for the discussion. It was brilliant. I hope you enjoyed it as well at home. And thank you for all of your questions. If you have any more questions, you can find our contact details fairly easily thanks to the internet. And hopefully we'll get to see you all soon. But thank you all for coming. And thank you, Marcus. And all the best with the book. And hopefully everyone reads it. So yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.